I sat at the dining room table, gripping my napkin as my father loudly declared to the entire room that I was a freeloader who had squandered my potential. For years, I let my family believe my government job was just a low-level, administrative pity hire. I swallowed their endless insults to protect my clearance and my team. But the smug smirk vanished from my dad's face when his billionaire boss walked into our home, looked directly at me, and snapped a sharp, respectful salute before calling me ma'am. The gravel of my parents' immaculately swept driveway crunched beneath the tires of my rented sedan. I sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, staring up at the sprawling, colonial-style home that had always felt more like a showroom than a sanctuary. It was Friday evening, and I was officially on a 2-week leave. After 18 months of running classified logistics and overseeing specialized intelligence operations in a dusty, undisclosed, desert compound, all I wanted was a quiet bed and a home-cooked meal. Unfortunately, in the Davidson household, peace was a currency we simply did not possess. I am Major Chloe Davidson of the United States Army, attached to a highly classified Joint Special Operations Command unit. My day-to-day involves coordinating multi-million-dollar defense contracts, evaluating experimental technology, and making operational decisions that keep boots on the ground alive. But to my family, I'm just Chloe, the underachiever. To maintain my security clearance and avoid the incessant, prying questions of my aggressively status-obsessed parents, my official cover story has always been painfully mundane. As far as my mother, Brenda, and my father, Richard, are concerned, I am a low-level GS5 data entry clerk working a tedious desk job for the Department of Defense. I push papers, I file reports, I am, in their eyes, a glorified secretary living off the taxpayer's dime. Taking a deep breath to steady my nerves, I grabbed my duffel bag and made my way to the heavy oak front door. Before I could even turn the knob, it swung open. My mother stood there, a frantic bundle of nervous energy wrapped in a tailored designer dress. Her hair was sprayed into an immovable blonde helmet, and her eyes immediately did a head-to-toe sweep of my outfit. "Chloe, you're finally here," she said, her tone lacking any warmth. She didn't reach for a hug. Instead, she reached out to aggressively adjust the collar of my plain gray sweater. "Is this what you're wearing? We have a very important guest arriving in less than 2 hours. I told you on the phone this was a formal evening." "Hi, Mom. It's good to see you." "Too," I replied, keeping my voice perfectly even. "I just got off a 14-hour flight. I brought a dress. I'll change before dinner." "Well, hurry up and put your bag in the guest room," she whispered harshly, ushering me inside as if I were an embarrassing secret. "Your father is an absolute wreck. Tonight has to be perfect." I stepped into the foyer, immediately hit by the overwhelming scent of lemon polish and roasting lamb. My father, Richard, was pacing the length of the living room, barking orders into his cell phone. My dad works as a senior regional manager for Sentinel Defense Solutions, a massive corporate defense contracting firm. For the past 5 years, he had been clawing his way up the corporate ladder, desperate to secure a vice president title. Tonight was his ultimate test. The CEO and founder of Sentinel, Arthur Kensington, was in town, and my father had somehow convinced the billionaire to come to our home for a private, intimate dinner. "Richard, she's here," my mother announced. My father paused his pacing, lowering his phone. He looked at me, his expression tightening into a familiar scowl. "Chloe, don't leave your cheap luggage in the hallway. Mr. Kensington will be here at 7 sharp. I need you out of the way. Understood? No talking about your little desk job. Kensington is a titan of the defense industry. I don't want you boring him with your complaints about government pension plans or whatever it is you do." "Understood, Dad," I said smoothly, picking up my duffel bag. As I walked toward the stairs, a shrill laugh echoed from the kitchen. Out strolled my younger sister, Abigail, clinging to the arm of her fiancé, Todd. Abigail was the golden child. She was a marketing director for a local cosmetics brand. And Todd was a flashy real estate agent who drove a leased sports car and spoke entirely in sales pitches. "Oh, look, the prodigal paper pusher returns," Abigail teased, flashing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She held up her left hand, ensuring the dining room chandelier caught the massive, gaudy diamond on her ring finger. "Did you manage to get time off from the copy machine, Chloe?" "Something like that," I muttered, gripping the strap of my bag tighter. "Hey, don't knock government work, babe," Todd chimed in, swirling a glass of scotch. "Someone has to sit in a cubicle so the rest of us can actually build the economy. Though, it is a shame about the taxes we pay to fund those cushy, do-nothing jobs." I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a combat knife. Todd was complaining about his taxes paying my salary, completely oblivious to the fact that his future father-in-law's entire corporate livelihood relied on defense contracts approved by people exactly like me. In fact, Sentinel Defense Solutions had recently submitted a massive, multi-billion-dollar bid for a next-generation drone logistics contract. A contract that currently sat on my desk, waiting for my signature. I didn't say a word. I just offered a tight, polite nod and retreated upstairs to the guest bedroom. As I unpacked my dress, I could hear my father's booming voice echoing through the floorboards, bragging to Todd about how tonight was going to change the family's legacy. I shook my head, feeling a profound sense of exhaustion that had nothing to do with jet lag. I was used to high-stakes negotiations with hostile entities, but surviving a weekend with my family always felt like walking through a minefield without a map. I changed into a simple, elegant navy blue dress, pinned my hair back into a sleek bun, and prepared to play the role of the quiet, disappointing daughter for one more night. By the time I came back downstairs, the tension in the house was suffocating. The dining table was set with my mother's finest china, and a tray of expensive, heavily manicured appetizers sat on the coffee table in the living room. My parents, Abigail and Todd, were gathered around it, sipping wine and looking like a staged photograph from a lifestyle magazine. I took a quiet seat in the corner armchair, pouring myself a glass of sparkling water. "So, Chloe," Todd started, leaning back on the plush sofa and crossing his ankle over his knee. "Abigail tells me you're still living in that tiny apartment near the base. Any plans to, step up? Buy a house? Invest in your future?" "I travel a lot for work, Todd," I replied calmly. "A house doesn't really make sense for me right now." "Travel?" My father scoffed loudly, pouring himself another glass of Cabernet. "Taking a bus to a different government building to file documents isn't exactly travel." "Chloe, let's not inflate what you do." "Richard, be nice," my mother scolded lightly, though she was adjusting her pearl necklace in the mirror and not looking at me. "She's doing the best she can. Not everyone has Abigail's drive." "I'm just being realistic." "Brenda," my father insisted, his face flushing slightly from the wine. He turned his harsh gaze directly onto me. "It's frustrating to watch. You had good grades. You could have gone into corporate law or finance. Instead, you took the lazy route, a lifetime government gig where you can't be fired. You just clock in, clock out, and live off the system." "Dad, that's not what I do," I said, my voice hardening just a fraction. It was a mistake to engage, but the fatigue was wearing down my usually ironclad discipline. "Oh, really?" my dad sneered, stepping closer. The stress of the impending dinner with his boss was clearly making him volatile, and I was his favorite punching bag. "Then what do you do, Chloe? Because from where I'm sitting, you're a freeloader. You live a small, insignificant life, funded by the taxes of hardworking people like Todd and myself. I bust my back making deals for Sentinel, keeping this country's defense robust, while you drain resources. You're 30 years old, and you have absolutely nothing to show for it. Dad, stop it." Abigail giggled, clearly enjoying the show. "You're going to make her cry before Mr. Kensington even gets here." I won't apologize for expecting excellence," my father declared pompously. "When Arthur Kensington walks through that door tonight, I want everyone to represent the Davidson standard. That means you stay quiet. Chloe. Speak only when spoken to, and for God's sake, do not embarrass me by talking about your lack of ambition." Before I could formulate a response that wouldn't violate the Espionage Act, a sharp, authoritative ring of the doorbell echoed through the house. The entire family froze. My father's aggressive posture instantly melted into a subservient, eager crouch. My mother gasped, rushing to smooth imaginary wrinkles from her dress. "He's here," my father hissed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Not one word." He practically sprinted to the foyer, throwing the front door open with a wide, overly enthusiastic smile. "Mr. Kensington, what an absolute honor. Please come in, come in. Welcome to our home." From my seat in the corner of the living room, I watched as Arthur Kensington stepped into the light. Even in his late 60s, the billionaire CEO was an imposing figure. He stood 6'2", with broad shoulders that betrayed his past as a Marine Corps officer. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, his silver hair cropped militarily close to his scalp. He exuded an aura of absolute command, a man completely accustomed to owning whatever room he walked into. "Richard, thank you for the invitation," Arthur said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone. He handed his coat to my fawning father. "It's always good to see how my top managers live. Let me introduce you to my family." My dad beamed, leading Arthur into the living room. "This is my beautiful wife, Brenda, my eldest daughter, Abigail, and her fiancé, Todd." Arthur nodded politely, shaking their hands with practiced corporate grace. "A pleasure to meet you all. You have a lovely home. Brenda." "Oh, thank you, Mr. Kensington." My mother gushed, practically vibrating with excitement. "Please, sit. We have some wonderful appetizers." Arthur turned toward the seating area, his eyes sweeping the room. That was when his gaze landed on me, sitting quietly in the corner armchair. My father quickly stepped into his line of sight, trying to block me out. "And, that is my youngest daughter, Chloe. She's just visiting for a few days. She works a clerical job for the government. Please, don't mind her." Arthur Kensington stopped dead in his tracks. The polite corporate smile vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated shock. He completely ignored my father, stepping around him to get a better look at me. I stood up slowly from the armchair, smoothing the skirt of my navy dress. I met his gaze, keeping my expression perfectly neutral. Arthur's eyes widened as the recognition fully set in. This was the man whose company's future rested entirely on Project Vanguard, the exact classified military logistics contract I was personally overseeing. We had never met in a social setting, but he had stood across from me in heavily guarded Pentagon briefing rooms. He knew exactly who held the authority over his multi-billion-dollar bids. To the absolute horror and confusion of my father, the billionaire CEO of Sentinel Defense Solutions suddenly stood at rigid attention. Arthur brought his right hand up in a crisp, flawless military salute. "Major Davidson," Arthur barked, his voice filled with profound respect. He dropped the salute and quickly extended his hand. "Ma'am, I had absolutely no idea you were Richard's daughter. It is an absolute honor to see you outside of the briefing room." The silence that fell over the living room was so absolute, so heavy, that you could have heard a pin drop on the thick Persian rug. My father's jaw had literally unhinged, hanging open as he stared at his boss. Todd froze with his wine glass halfway to his mouth. My mother let out a small, breathless squeak. I took Arthur's hand, offering a firm, confident handshake. "Good evening, Mr. Kensington. It's a small world, isn't it?" The silence in our formal living room was absolute, stretching out until it felt like the oxygen was being slowly sucked from the air. My father, Richard, looked as though he had just been struck by lightning. his wine glass tilted dangerously in his grip, a single drop of dark red Cabernet spilling over the rim and staining his expensive cuff. He stared at Arthur Kensington's outstretched hand, then at my calm, composed face, his mind visibly struggling and failing to process the reality unfolding in front of him. Major? My father finally choked out, his voice a pathetic, reedy squeak that I had never heard from him before. Mr. Kensington, I think there's been some sort of mistake. This is Chloe. She's a clerk. She files paperwork in a cubicle. Arthur slowly pulled his hand back from mine, turning his imposing frame to face my father. The warm, polite corporate demeanor he had brought into the house evaporated, replaced by the hardened, analytical glare of a man who did not tolerate foolishness. He looked at my father as if he were a particularly slow child who had just failed a basic arithmetic test. "Richard, what on earth are you talking about?" Arthur's gravelly voice carried a distinct edge of reprimand. "A clerk? Do you honestly not know what your own daughter does for a living?" She... My father stammered, his face flushing a deep, mottled purple. He looked to my mother for support, but Brenda was frozen in place, her meticulously manicured hands hovering near her throat. "Major Chloe Davidson," Arthur announced, his voice booming through the quiet room, "is the lead logistical commander for a highly classified division of the Joint Special Operations Command. She holds a top-secret clearance that makes my own security access look like a library card. We spent 3 days locked in a secure Pentagon briefing room last month, debating the tactical viability of a $3 billion aerospace supply chain." He turned back to me, a warm, genuine smile breaking through his stern features. "You tore my lead engineers to shreds. Major, it was a masterclass. Your team's projections were overly optimistic regarding thermal degradation in desert climates. Sir," I replied smoothly, taking a deliberate sip of my sparkling water. "I simply needed them to ground their math in reality before putting my people at risk. And you were entirely right to do so." Arthur chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound of appreciation. Wait, Todd interjected, letting out a nervous, high-pitched laugh as he set his scotch down on the coffee table. He ran a hand through his heavily gelled hair. "Hold on. Chloe? Our Chloe? The one who lives in that tiny apartment? You're telling me she's some kind of, military VIP?" Arthur's eyes snapped to Todd, narrowing dangerously. "I am telling you, young man, that Major Davidson holds the operational keys to some of the most critical defense infrastructure in the United States. She is a decorated officer who has overseen deployments that you do not have the clearance to even dream about." VIP is a gross understatement. Abigail, clearly entirely unaccustomed to not being the center of attention, crossed her arms defensively. The massive diamond on her finger caught the light, but for once, no one was looking at it. "Well, she never told us any of that. She always said she just did admin work. Why would she lie to her own family?" I met my sister's resentful glare with calm indifference. "It's called operational security, Abigail, and frankly, given the conversations we normally have in this house, maintaining a low profile seemed like the safest tactical decision." My father finally seemed to recover basic motor functions. He set his wine glass down with a shaky hand and plastered on a terrifyingly wide, frantic smile. The corporate survival instincts were kicking in, desperately trying to salvage a situation he still didn't fully understand. "Well," Richard clapped his hands together, the sound sharp and jarring. "Well, isn't this just a fantastic surprise? I mean, a father is always the last to know." "Right. Arthur, you know how these kids are with their secrets. But enough business talk. Brenda has prepared an absolute feast. Shall we move to the dining room?" My mother snapped out of her stupor. Yes, of course. Right this way. Mr. Kensington." She rushed toward the dining room, desperately trying to regain control of her meticulously planned evening. The table was set with custom place cards. My mother had predictably seated Abigail and Todd right next to Arthur, placing my father at the head of the table. My designated seat was banished to the far end, near the kitchen door, where I could be easily ignored. Arthur walked into the dining room, glancing at the beautiful table arrangement. He picked up the ornate place card bearing his name, looked at it, and then set it back down. "Actually, Brenda," Arthur said, his tone perfectly polite, but leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "If you don't mind, I'd like to sit down at the far end, next to the major." My mother froze, a silver serving spoon trembling in her hand. "But, Mr. Kensington, the lighting is much better down here, and Richard wanted to discuss the new regional projections with you." "Richard and I can discuss spreadsheets anytime," Arthur interrupted, already walking past the prime seating, to pull out the chair directly to my left. He sat down heavily, smoothing his napkin over his lap. "It is exceptionally rare that I get the chance to pick the brain of JSOC's finest logistical mind outside of a classified bunker. I intend to take full advantage of it. Major, please, have a seat." I walked to the far end of the table, pulling out my chair. As I sat down, I made brief eye contact with my father. He was standing at the head of the table, clutching the back of his chair so tightly his knuckles were stark white. The smug, condescending patriarch who had called me a freeloader barely 20 minutes ago was gone. In his place was a terrified middle manager who had just realized he was standing on a trap door, and I was holding the lever. Dinner commenced in a state of excruciating, impalpable tension. My mother's roasted lamb was flawless, the asparagus perfectly seasoned, but the family was eating as if the food had turned to ash in their mouths. The usual symphony of my parents bragging about Abigail's marketing campaigns or Todd's real estate commissions was entirely absent. Instead, the dining room was dominated by Arthur Kensington, and his entire focus was exclusively on me. "So, Major," Arthur said, slicing into his lamb with clinical precision. "Off the record, of course, what is the command's current posture on automated drone resupply networks? Sentinel is heavily invested in the R&D, but we're hitting bureaucratic walls." "The technology is promising, Arthur," I replied, easily slipping into my professional cadence. It was bizarre to use this tone in my childhood dining room. But from my chair, the vulnerability isn't the hardware, it's the signal encryption. If a hostile entity intercepts the frequency of an automated resupply drone, they don't just steal a payload, they trace the flight path backward and pinpoint our forward operating bases. Until Sentinel can guarantee an uncrackable closed-loop signal, Command won't sign off. Arthur pointed his fork at me, his eyes gleaming with profound respect. "Exactly. That is exactly what I told my board of directors last Tuesday. You see the board immediately. Major, most people get lost in the flash of the technology." "Excuse me, Arthur," my father interjected, his voice trembling slightly. He was desperately trying to claw his way back into the conversation, desperate to prove his worth in his own home. "If I may, Sentinel's regional division, my division, has actually been looking into a new proprietary software that might mitigate those signal risks. As vice president, I would ensure—" "Richard," Arthur cut him off, not even looking in his direction. The dismissal was so casual, so absolute, it was breathtaking. "You run domestic supply logistics for standard issue body armor. You don't have the clearance to even read the summary page of the drone initiative. Leave the tactical discussions to the adults in the room." A sharp, undignified sound escaped my father's throat, something between a gasp and a whimper. Todd, sensing the blood in the water, tried to pivot the conversation to save his future father-in-law. "Well, it's just amazing," Todd said loudly, waving his wine glass. "Chloe, we are all just so proud of you. Truly, I mean, who knew we had a real American hero sitting right here at the table? We should throw a party for you before you go back to wherever it is you go." I turned my head slowly to look at Todd. 30 minutes ago. "Todd, you were complaining about how your tax dollars were funding my cushy do-nothing government job? Now you want to throw me a parade?" Todd's fake salesman smile shattered. He shrank back into his chair, suddenly finding his dinner plate fascinating. Abigail glared at me, her cheeks flushed with angry embarrassment, but she knew better than to say a word while Arthur was watching. Arthur paused with his wine glass halfway to his mouth. His dark eyes flicked between me, Todd, and my father. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "A do-nothing job?" Arthur repeated quietly. The danger in his voice was unmistakable. He set his glass down. "Is that what you think of the major, Richard? Is that what your family thinks?" My father swallowed hard, beads of sweat breaking out on his forehead. "Arthur, no, please. It was just family banter. We were joking around. We didn't know." "You didn't know her rank," Arthur corrected sharply, his voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. "But you knew she wore the uniform of the United States Armed Forces. You knew she served her country." Arthur leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach. He fixed my father with a stare that could have melted steel. "You know, Richard, it's a funny thing. When I walked up to your front door tonight, before I rang the bell, I paused on the porch. I heard shouting from the living room. My blood ran cold, but I kept my face entirely neutral. My father stopped breathing entirely. I heard you berating someone," Arthur continued, his voice low, deliberate, and devastating. "I heard you call someone a freeloader, someone who drained resources, someone who was a disappointment because they didn't chase corporate titles." Arthur turned his gaze to me, his expression softening just a fraction, a silent apology in his eyes. Then he looked back at my father, the absolute fury returning. "I assumed you were yelling at a delinquent nephew, or perhaps this idiot son-in-law of yours. I never, in my wildest nightmares, imagined you were speaking to a major in the United States Army. Your own daughter. Sir, my father croaked, tears of sheer panic welling in his eyes. "I was stressed about this dinner. I misspoke. I want nothing but the best for Sentinel, for you. What you want is a vice presidency, Richard," Arthur stated bluntly, stripping away the last remnants of my father's dignity. "And you invited me here tonight to audition for it. Well, let me tell you how this industry actually works. Sentinel Defense Solutions survives on government contracts. Specifically, we are currently bidding on Project Vanguard, a $4 billion logistical overhaul." Arthur gestured toward me with an open palm. "The final signature required to approve that bid, the final authority on whether Sentinel gets $4 billion or goes bankrupt, belongs to the commander of JSOC Logistics," Arthur said, relishing the absolute terror blooming on my father's face. "It belongs to Major Chloe Davidson," my mother gasped, dropping her fork onto her china plate with a loud, ringing clatter. Abigail's jaw went slack. My father looked as if he were about to vomit. "You called the gatekeeper to our company's survival a freeloader," Arthur whispered, shaking his head in profound disgust. "You demonstrated a catastrophic lack of judgment, a staggering lack of respect, and a fundamental inability to assess the value of the people around you. If you treat your own flesh and blood this way, Richard, I shudder to think how you manage my employees." Arthur stood up from the table, tossing his linen napkin onto his half-eaten plate. The dinner was over. "Don't bother coming into the office on Monday. Richard, Human Resources will send your severance package in the mail." The heavy oak front door clicked shut behind Arthur Kensington, but the sound echoed through the dining room like a thunderclap. For a long, agonizing minute, nobody moved. The only sound was the low hum of the central air conditioning and the frantic, shallow breathing of my father. He stood near the head of the table, his face devoid of all color, staring at the empty space where the billionaire CEO of Sentinel Defense Solutions had just been standing. The reality of what had just transpired was a massive, jagged pill, and it was violently lodged in his throat. "Richard," my mother whispered, her voice trembling so violently it cracked. "Richard, what What just happened? Did he just... My father slowly turned his gaze away from the hallway and looked at me. The sheer panic in his eyes was rapidly metastasizing into a desperate, feral kind of rage. His entire life's work, his identity, his meticulously crafted country club facade had just been incinerated in less than 3 minutes. And in his mind, it wasn't his own arrogance that had lit the match. It was me. "Fix this," my father hissed, his hands gripping the edge of the mahogany dining table so hard the table rattled. "Chloe, you are going to march out there, get in his car, and fix this right now." I picked up my linen napkin, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table. "I can't do that. Dad!" "You can and you will," he roared, finally snapping. He lunged forward a step, knocking over his wine glass. The remaining red wine bled across my mother's expensive white tablecloth, dripping onto the hardwood floor like a fresh wound. "You are going to tell Arthur that it was a misunderstanding. You are going to tell him that I am a good father, that I am a crucial asset to his company, and that if he doesn't reinstate my position, you will pull the plug on his precious Project Vanguard contract." I looked at him, completely unbothered by his volume. I had been screamed at by 4-star generals. The tantrums of a middle management corporate climber didn't even move the needle on my heart rate. "What you are suggesting, Dad, is a direct violation of the Federal Acquisition Regulation," I explained, keeping my voice dangerously calm and flat. "Using my position as a military officer to extort a civilian defense contractor for the personal financial gain of a family member is a federal crime. It carries a mandatory sentence in Leavenworth, so, no, I won't be doing that." "You selfish, arrogant little brat," he spat, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "After everything I've done for you, after raising you, putting a roof over your head, you owe me this. You have the power to save my career with a single phone call, and you're talking to me about regulations?" "I don't owe you a damn thing," I replied, the icy edge in my voice finally cutting through. I stood up, pushing my chair back. I was no longer the quiet daughter in the corner. I was Major Davidson, and I was taking command of the room. For 10 years, I have sat at this table and swallowed your insults. I let you mock my paycheck. I let you belittle my service. I let you call me a freeloader because it was easier than explaining the complexities of global tactical logistics to a man whose biggest daily challenge is hitting a golf ball out of a sand trap. Abigail, finding her voice, stood up defensively. "Don't you dare talk to Dad like that. He just lost his job because of you." "He lost his job because of himself. Abigail," I shot back, locking eyes with my sister. "Arthur Kensington didn't fire him because I'm a major. He fired him because he realized Dad is a liability. Sentinel Defense operates on discretion, respect, and chain of command. Dad just proved to his boss that he possesses none of those traits. If Arthur had awarded that $4 billion contract to a company managed by a man who openly disrespects United States military personnel in his own home, the Department of Defense would have launched an audit by Tuesday. Arthur cut off a dead limb to save his tree. It's business." Todd, still sitting, nervously adjusted his designer tie. "Look, Chloe, maybe we all said some things we regret, but this is family. Can't you just make an introduction? Introduce me to some of the brass at Fort Liberty? I handle commercial real estate. Maybe we can work out a mutual benefit that smooths this whole thing over." I actually laughed. It was a cold, humorless sound that made Todd flinch. "You want to leverage my security clearance to sell strip malls to the government. Todd, are you actually that dense? Or is it just the hair gel seeping into your brain? Do not ever ask me for a military favor again." My mother burst into heavy, dramatic sobs, sinking into her chair and burying her face in her hands. "The country club," she wailed, mourning the only thing she truly cared about. "The neighbors. What are we going to tell the neighbors? Richard, everyone knows Arthur was coming tonight. The Harrison family is going to laugh us out of the neighborhood." "Shut up, Brenda," my father barked, wildly raking a hand through his thinning hair. He turned back to me, his eyes wide with a frantic, begging desperation. Chloe, please, I am 61 years old. I have a mortgage on this house. I have Abigail's wedding to pay for. If Sentinel fires me, I lose my stock options. I lose my pension. Nobody is going to hire a disgraced 61-year-old executive in this economy. You have to call General Henderson. You told me about a General Henderson once. Call him. Tell him Sentinel is the right choice, but only if I'm attached to the account. I stared at the man who had tormented my self-esteem for a decade. I thought about the men and women under my command. I thought about Sergeant David Miller, who lost a leg pulling our logistics convoy out of an ambush in Kandahar because a civilian contractor had cut corners on our vehicle armor. My job was to protect them, to ensure the equipment they relied on was flawless. Putting a man as compromised and arrogant as my father anywhere near their supply chain was not just unethical, it was deadly. General Bradley Henderson is the commander of the Joint Special Operations Command, I said quietly, leaning forward slightly. He doesn't care about your mortgage, Dad, and neither do I. You dug this grave. Now you get to lie in it. I didn't wait for another outburst. I turned on my heel and walked out of the dining room, leaving the smoking crater of my family's pride behind me. The silence that followed my exit was heavy, punctuated only by my mother's theatrical weeping and the distinct clink of Todd pouring himself another massive glass of scotch. I climbed the sweeping mahogany staircase to the guest bedroom. The moment I closed the door, I let out a long, shuddering breath. The adrenaline that had fueled my confrontation downstairs was beginning to ebb, leaving behind a profound, hollow exhaustion. I walked over to the closet, pulled out my olive-drab military duffel bag, and threw it onto the pristine white duvet of the guest bed. I had been in this house for less than 3 hours, and I was already extracting myself from the hostile territory. I changed out of the navy blue dress, quickly pulling on my favorite pair of faded denim jeans and a plain black tactical fleece. I began shoving my belongings back into the duffel, working with the practiced efficiency of a soldier who had packed out of combat zones in the middle of the night. Just as I was zipping up the bag, the bedroom door opened without a knock. My mother, Brenda, stood in the doorway. Her makeup was slightly smeared, her carefully constructed hair looking slightly frayed at the edges. She stepped into the room, closing the door softly behind her. For a moment, she just looked at me, her eyes filled with a complicated mixture of grief, anger, and awe. "Are you really leaving?" she asked, her voice tight. "My presence here is only going to escalate the situation." "Mom," I replied, grabbing my toiletry bag from the ensuite bathroom and tossing it into the duffel. "Dad needs time to process the consequences of his actions. I don't want to be in the crossfire when he fully realizes what just happened." Brenda crossed her arms, rubbing her elbows defensively. "You're punishing him. Chloe, you planned this, didn't you? You sat there, letting him make a fool of himself, knowing who you were all along." I stopped packing and turned to face her, utterly astounded by her capacity for delusion. "I planned this? Mom, I didn't invite Arthur Kensington to dinner. I didn't tell Dad to spend the last 5 years calling me a failure. I didn't force Dad to humiliate me in front of the CEO. I literally sat in a corner, drank sparkling water, and kept my mouth shut, exactly as I was ordered to do." "But you could have told us," she argued, stepping closer. "If we had known you were a major, if we had known you had power, we would have treated you differently." "And that right there is the tragedy of this family," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You shouldn't have to wear a silver oak leaf cluster on your chest for your own parents to treat you with basic human dignity. You only respect power. Mom, you only respect money. I am exactly the same person I was yesterday. The only difference is that now you know I hold the leash." Brenda flinched as if I had physically struck her. She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. The truth of my statement was undeniable, even to her. "I'm going back to my apartment," I said, shouldering my heavy duffel bag. "I'm taking the rest of my leave in peace. Tell Dad that if he tries to contact my commanding officers to salvage his job, I will personally file a harassment complaint with the Department of Defense Inspector General. I walked past her, leaving her standing alone in the middle of the guest room. As I made my way down the stairs, the front door was already in sight. I just needed to get through the foyer. Unfortunately, Todd was lurking near the entryway, nervously checking his Rolex. When he saw me, he plastered on a slimy, conciliatory smile. "Hey, Chloe, listen. Before you take off," Todd whispered, leaning in conspiratorially. "I know things got heated in there. Richard is a dinosaur, right? But you and me, we're the younger generation. We understand synergy. If you ever need to discreetly invest some of that hazard pay, or if your friends at JSOC are looking for off-base luxury rentals near Fort Liberty, I can hook you up. No commissions, just keeping it in the family." I stared at Todd, marveling at the pure, unadulterated opportunism radiating from him. My father's career was bleeding out on the dining room floor, and Todd was trying to pick my pocket for a real estate commission. "Todd," I said slowly, deliberately dropping my voice to a dangerous, authoritative register. "If you ever approach me about military contracts, base housing, or my soldiers' finances again, I will have the military police ban you from every installation within a 300-mile radius. And if you think I can't do that, ask Arthur Kensington." Todd's slimy smile vanished instantly. He took 3 rapid steps backward, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "Loud and clear, Major. Loud and clear." I walked out the front door, the cool night air hitting my face like a physical relief. The crickets were chirping in the manicured bushes, entirely oblivious to the nuclear explosion that had just decimated the Davidson household. I threw my bag into the trunk of my rented sedan, climbed into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The colonial house looked perfectly normal from the outside, a beacon of upper-middle-class success. But I knew the foundation was cracked beyond repair. I picked up my cell phone and pressed a speed dial number. It rang twice before a crisp, professional voice answered. "Captain Jenkins," the voice said. "Sarah, it's Chloe," I said, navigating the dark suburban streets. "I need you to log a memo for the record regarding the Sentinel Defense Solutions bid on Project Vanguard. I just had an unplanned, off-the-books encounter with their CEO, Arthur Kensington." "Understood, Major," Captain Jenkins replied, her tone immediately shifting to business. "Is there a conflict of interest we need to declare?" "No conflict," I said, a faint, genuine smile finally touching my lips as I accelerated onto the highway, leaving my parents' neighborhood behind in the dust. In fact, I think Sentinel just solved their biggest internal liability. The sanctuary of my apartment was exactly as I had left it, Spartan, meticulously organized, and blissfully silent. I woke up at 0500 on Monday morning without an alarm. After the psychological warfare of my parents' dining room, my scheduled 2-week leave suddenly felt like a prison sentence of idle time. I needed the structured chaos of the base. I needed the comforting hum of encrypted servers and the sharp, unambiguous communication of my soldiers. I made a pot of black coffee, laced up my combat boots, and drove my sedan toward the heavily fortified gates of Fort Liberty. Passing through the physical security barriers always gave me a profound sense of clarity. The armed military police officers at the checkpoint didn't care about my family pedigree, the brand of my car, or my mother's country club standing. They checked my CAC card, snapped a crisp salute, and waved me through. Here. Respect was earned through blood, sweat, and operational competence, not through leasing a sports car you couldn't afford. I walked into the Joint Special Operations Command Logistics bullpen just as the sun was breaching the horizon. The room was already alive with the low murmur of classified conversations and the clacking of keyboards. My second in command, Captain Sarah Jenkins, looked up from her dual monitor setup as I pushed through the heavy glass doors. Sarah was a razor-sharp West Point graduate who possessed an uncanny ability to spot a mathematical error in a supply manifest from 10 yards away. "Major," Sarah said, standing up quickly, a look of mild surprise crossing her features. "You're supposed to be on leave for another 12 days. Did command call you in?" "No. Captain." The civilian world proved to be entirely too hostile. I replied dryly, setting my coffee mug down on my desk. I decided I'd rather deal with insurgent supply line disruptions than spend another 48 hours with my relatives. "What did I miss?" Sarah smirked, perfectly accustomed to my lack of sentimentality. She picked up a thick blue folder and followed me into my glass-walled office. "Well, ma'am, it's been an interesting 48 hours regarding Project Vanguard. Sentinel Defense Solutions submitted a formally revised bid at 0200 this morning." I sat down in my ergonomic chair, my interest instantly piqued. "Arthur Kensington works fast. Let's see it." Sarah opened the folder, pulling out the executive summary. The technical specifications remain largely identical to last week's proposal, with one notable addition. Kensington has personally attached a legally binding addendum regarding their internal encryption team, but the most interesting part isn't the tech. Major. It's the corporate restructuring. She handed me a piece of Sentinel letterhead. I scanned the document, my eyes landing on a highlighted paragraph near the bottom of the page. It was a formal declaration to the Department of Defense regarding key personnel changes, a standard requirement for contractors handling top-secret clearances. The paragraph read, "Effective immediately. Richard Davidson, former Vice President of Regional Domestic Supply, has been terminated from Sentinel Defense Solutions. This termination is the result of a comprehensive internal review which revealed a catastrophic misalignment with the core ethical values, discretion, and leadership standards required to partner with the United States Armed Forces." I leaned back in my chair, exhaling a long, slow breath. Arthur Kensington hadn't just fired my father, he had officially documented the termination in a federal bidding proposal by explicitly stating that my father lacked the ethical standards to work with the military. Arthur had essentially blacklisted him from the entire defense contracting industry. No rival firm would ever touch him now. "Is there a problem, Major?" Sarah asked, watching my face carefully. She didn't know the full extent of the dinner disaster, only that I had requested a memo regarding my encounter with Arthur. "No problem, Captain," I said, sliding the paper back across my desk. "Kensington is just cleaning house. He's proving that he won't tolerate liabilities in his supply chain. It's exactly the kind of ruthless efficiency I want in a logistics partner." Before Sarah could respond, my personal cell phone, sitting face down on my desk, began to vibrate violently. It buzzed against the wood, a relentless, angry, mechanical sound. I flipped it over. The screen was completely choked with notifications. I had 34 missed calls, 82 text messages from my mother, and 14 voicemails from Abigail. I unlocked the screen and clicked on the most recent text from my sister. "Abigail, you ruined everything. Dad's keycard was deactivated this morning. Security escorted him out of the building in front of his entire floor. They didn't even let him pack his own desk. He is completely losing his mind. Answer your phone, you psycho." I deleted the message without replying. Then, my desk phone, the secure, encrypted military line that only high-ranking officials and cleared personnel possessed, began to ring. Sarah raised an eyebrow, stepping back to give me privacy. I picked up the receiver. "Major Davidson." "Chloe, you listen to me very carefully." My father's voice hissed through the earpiece. The sound was distorted, thick with a terrifying cocktail of panic and unhinged fury. "You have destroyed my life. I am sitting in my car outside the Sentinel building, and a rent-a-cop just handed me my belongings in a cardboard box." "A cardboard box? Chloe, how did you get this number?" "Dad?" I asked, my voice dropping to a glacial chill. "This is a restricted federal line." "I memorized it off a piece of your mail 3 years ago," he shouted, his voice cracking wildly. "You think you can just walk away from this? I built this family. I paid for your braces, your college applications. You are going to fix this, or I swear to God, I will come down to that base and make sure your commanding officers know exactly what kind of vindictive, treacherous daughter they have serving under them. Dad, if you approach this installation, it will be the biggest mistake of your rapidly deteriorating life," I warned him, gripping the receiver tightly. "You are spiraling. Go home. Talk to a lawyer if you must, but do not bring this to my doorstep." "Watch me," he snarled, the line abruptly going dead. I slowly hung up the phone, a cold knot forming in the pit of my stomach. My father was a narcissist who had just suffered the ultimate public humiliation. He was cornered, stripped of his precious corporate title, and desperate for a scapegoat. And in his delusional state, he genuinely believed that his civilian entitlement could penetrate the armored gates of the United States military. It took exactly 3 hours for my father's empty threat to materialize into a profoundly stupid reality. I was in the middle of a classified briefing with the Joint Chiefs Liaison regarding the thermal degradation of lithium batteries in desert climates when the red emergency light on my desk phone began to blink. It was the direct line from the base's Visitor Control Center. I held up a hand, pausing the briefing, and picked up the receiver. "Davidson! Major Davidson, this is Sergeant Miller down at the main gate." The military police officer's voice came through, sounding strained and deeply annoyed. "Ma'am, we have a civilian situation here. An older gentleman driving a silver Mercedes is blocking the commercial inspection lane. He does not have a DoD identification card. He refuses to turn his vehicle around, and he is loudly demanding an immediate audience with your commanding officer, General Henderson." I closed my eyes, rubbing the bridge of my nose as a spike of pure, unadulterated embarrassment shot through my skull. "Let me guess, Sergeant. He says he's a VIP defense contractor and that I am illegally orchestrating his termination?" Those were his exact words. "Major." Sergeant Miller confirmed. "He is currently threatening to call his congressman and have my stripes removed because I asked him to step out of his vehicle. I have 2 squad cars standing by. How would you like us to proceed, ma'am?" "Do not let him through that gate, Sergeant," I commanded, standing up from my desk. "I am on my way down. Keep him contained." I apologized to the liaison, cutting the briefing short, and marched out of JSOC headquarters. The North Carolina heat hit me like a physical wall as I climbed into a perimeter patrol jeep. I drove the 2 miles to the main gate with my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. My father had truly lost his grip on reality. He thought he could pull a Karen at a highly secure military installation that housed the nation's most lethal special operators. When I pulled up to the Visitor Control Center, the scene was exactly as chaotic as I had anticipated. My father's silver Mercedes was parked diagonally across the inspection lane, blocking 2 massive supply trucks. 4 heavily armed MPs, wearing tactical vests and carrying M4 rifles, had formed a perimeter around the car. My father was standing outside the driver's side door, in his face bright red, wearing a rumpled suit that looked like he had slept in it. He was jabbing his finger aggressively at a stoic, broad-shouldered MP. "You have no idea who you are dealing with," my father screamed, his voice echoing off the concrete barriers. "I am Richard Davidson. I demand to speak to General Henderson right now. My daughter is operating a rogue vendetta, and I am going to see her court-martialed for interfering with civilian commerce." "Sir, for the final time, step back from the vehicle and place your hands on the hood," the MP ordered, his hand resting casually on his holstered sidearm. I slammed the Jeep into park, threw open the door, and marched directly into the center of the standoff. "Stand down, Sergeant. I've got this." The MPs instantly snapped to attention, recognizing my rank and clearance badge. They lowered their posture but kept their eyes locked on my father. Richard whipped around, his eyes wild with desperate, manic triumph. There she is. You see? I told you. Chloe. Tell these glorified mall cops to back off. I want to see your general. Now. I stopped 3 feet away from him, my posture rigidly at attention, projecting an aura of absolute frozen authority. I didn't see my father in that moment. I saw a civilian threat causing a security disruption at my checkpoint. Richard Davidson, I said, using his full name. The formal, icy detachment in my voice made him blink in confusion. You are currently standing on federal property, blocking a critical logistics artery for the United States military. You are screaming at federal law enforcement officers. You are completely out of your depth, and you have exactly 60 seconds to get in your car and drive away before I have you arrested for trespassing and creating a public disturbance. You can't do that, he sputtered, taking a step toward me. The MP to his left immediately stepped forward, blocking his path. My father shrank back, finally registering the very real, very loaded weapons surrounding him. I have rights. I am a taxpayer. I know about Project Vanguard. I will go to the press. I will tell them you're handing out contracts based on personal vendettas. Go to the press. I challenged him, my voice dangerously soft. Please, Dad, call the New York Times. Tell them that Arthur Kensington fired you because you spent a family dinner humiliating a JSOC commander in front of him. Tell them that Sentinel fired you because you are an arrogant liability. Show the press the internal memo Kensington filed this morning, officially deeming you ethically compromised. Let's see how many corporate boards want to hire you after that story runs. The color drained from his face entirely. His mouth opened and closed, like a fish pulled out of water, but no sound came out. The realization was finally penetrating his thick skull. He had no leverage. He had no power. The corporate bluster that had terrified his underlings for years was completely useless out here in the real world. You have nothing, Dad, I said, delivering the final surgical strike to his ego. Your title is gone, your leverage is gone, and if you ever try to weaponize my military service against me again, I will not hesitate to let these officers do their jobs. You are not a VIP here. You are a civilian causing a nuisance. I turned to Sergeant Miller. Sergeant, if this man's vehicle is not moving in the opposite direction in 30 seconds, detain him, process him, and impound the car. Yes, ma'am, Sergeant Miller barked. I didn't look back. I turned around, walked back to my patrol jeep, and climbed in. As I shifted into gear, I watched through the rearview mirror, my father, defeated, shaking, and completely broken, slowly climbed back into his Mercedes. The MPs watched him like hawks as he shakily put the car in reverse, performed a humiliating 3-point turn, and drove away from the gates of Fort Liberty. The freeloader had just evicted the patriarch, and as I drove back to my headquarters to approve a $4 billion contract, I had never felt more at home. The official approval for Project Vanguard was signed exactly 1 week after my father's humiliating display at the Fort Liberty gates. I sat at my meticulously organized desk, the heavy, gold-plated pen gliding across the final page of the $4 billion authorization. As I placed the document into the outgoing classified courier pouch, I felt a profound sense of closure. Sentinel Defense Solutions had won the bid on the sheer, undeniable merit of their revised encryption protocols, free from the tainted, nepotistic liability that was Richard Davidson. Later that afternoon, a secure email pinged into my inbox. It was from Arthur Kensington. The message was characteristically brief and devoid of corporate fluff. Major Davidson, the contract has been received. Sentinel is honored to serve the command. Furthermore, our internal restructuring is complete. Our supply chain is now secure, both technically and ethically. Respectfully, Arthur. I deleted the email, ensuring no trace of personal correspondence remained on the server. The business was concluded. I assumed the family drama was too... I was wrong. 3 weeks into my return to active duty, the dust had allegedly settled in the civilian world, but the financial shockwaves were just beginning to tear through my parents' home. I was reviewing a supply manifest for a forward operating base in Djibouti when my personal cell phone rang. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. I stared at it for a long time, listening to the persistent vibration against my desk. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. "Chloe?" Brenda's voice was completely stripped of its usual haughty, country club arrogance. She sounded frail, breathless, and utterly frantic. "Chloe, please don't hang up. Please." "I'm at work. Mom, make it fast," I replied, my tone flat and uncompromising. "I need to see you," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Not at the house. Your father. He hasn't gotten out of bed in 4 days. The house is suffocating. Can we please just meet for coffee? Somewhere off base? I won't cause a scene. I swear to you." A part of me wanted to sever the line and block the number, but my tactical training reminded me that ignoring a deteriorating situation rarely neutralized it. It was better to assess the threat directly. "There is a diner 2 miles east of the main gate. I can give you exactly 20 minutes at 1300 hours. Do not be late." When I walked into the greasy, neon-lit diner at 1 o'clock, I almost didn't recognize her. Brenda Davidson, a woman who usually refused to check the mail without a full face of makeup and a tailored blouse, was sitting in a cracked vinyl booth wearing oversized sunglasses and a shapeless gray cardigan. She looked like a ghost of her former self. I slid into the booth across from her, keeping my posture straight. I didn't order anything. "Thank you for coming," she whispered, pulling off the sunglasses to reveal dark, heavy bags under her bloodshot eyes. "I know you hate us right now. I know what your father did was unforgivable." "Mom, I don't hate you," I corrected her gently, but firmly. "Hate requires an emotional investment that I simply do not possess for this situation. I am indifferent. What do you want?" Brenda swallowed hard, wrapping her hands around a chipped ceramic coffee mug as if it were a lifeline. "It's bad, Chloe. It's worse than you can imagine. Your father didn't just lose his job. When Sentinel fired him with cause, he lost his unvested stock options. The severance package was the absolute legal minimum, and we have debts." I raised an eyebrow. "Debts? Dad has been making a mid-six-figure salary for a decade. You don't understand how much it costs to maintain our lifestyle," she hissed, a brief, desperate flash of her old defensive entitlement shining through before crumbling again. "The mortgage on that house is enormous. The country club dues, the cars, and Abigail's wedding. Chloe. The final deposits for the venue and the caterer are due on Friday. It's over $50,000. We don't have it. The credit cards are maxed out. Your father was banking on that vice president promotion to pay for it all." I stared at her, genuinely astounded by the sheer, mathematical irresponsibility of their existence. They had built an empire of sand, entirely financed by debt and the arrogant assumption that the corporate gravy train would never derail. "So cancel the wedding," I stated plainly, "or scale it down. Abigail can get married at the courthouse." "She can't," Brenda gasped, looking genuinely horrified by the suggestion. "The Harrison family is coming. The entire country club is invited. If we cancel the wedding, everyone will know we're broke. The humiliation will kill your father. It will ruin Abigail's reputation. And let me guess." I leaned forward, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You called the freeloader to ask for a bailout. You want me to give you $50,000 to fund a party I was banished to the corner for?" Brenda burst into tears, covering her face with her hands. "Please, Chloe. You have no expenses. You live in that tiny apartment. You have a government pension. You must have savings. Just loan us the money. I will pay you back, I swear." "With what, Mom?" I asked, completely immune to her weeping. "Dad is blacklisted from the only industry he knows. You haven't worked in 30 years. You are entirely insolvent." I stood up from the booth, looking down at the woman who had prioritized the opinions of her country club over the character of her daughter. "Listen to me very carefully. I am not giving you a dime. Sell the silver, sell the Mercedes, sell the house, but do not ever contact me again to fund your delusions." I turned and walked out of the diner, leaving my mother sobbing quietly into her hands, entirely alone in the wreckage of her own making. The refusal to fund Abigail's lavish $50,000 wedding deposit was the final structural beam holding up the Davidson family facade. Once I pulled that support away, the entire house of cards came violently crashing down. I knew the fallout would be spectacular, but I severely underestimated the collateral damage it would inflict on my sister's perfectly curated life. It was a rainy Thursday evening, exactly 4 days after my grim coffee shop meeting with my mother. I was in my apartment, sitting at my small kitchen table and disassembling my personal sidearm for a routine cleaning. The repetitive, mechanical click of the slide and the sharp smell of gun oil were grounding. The television was playing the local news on low volume. Suddenly, a frantic, rhythmic pounding echoed through my apartment. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the desperate hammering of someone who was completely out of options. I set the slide of the pistol down, wiped my hands on a rag, and walked to the door. I checked the peephole. Standing in the dimly lit hallway, completely soaked by the pouring rain and shivering violently, was my sister, Abigail. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in thick, black rivers, and she was clutching a soggy cardboard box to her chest. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Abigail didn't wait for an invitation. She pushed past me into the entryway, dropping the wet cardboard box onto my hardwood floor. The box hit the ground with a heavy thud, spilling a chaotic mess of designer shoes, high-end makeup palettes, and framed photographs across the rug. "He left me," Abigail choked out, her voice a raw, jagged sob. She wrapped her arms around herself, trembling so hard her teeth were chattering. "Todd left me." I closed the door, locking it behind me, and turned to face my sister. I felt a brief flicker of pity, quickly smothered by the glaring predictability of the situation. "I take it he found out Dad's Sentinel money was gone?" Abigail slumped against the wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor amidst her scattered belongings. She buried her face in her knees and began to weep with an ugly, agonizing intensity. It was the first time in my life I had ever seen my sister look genuinely vulnerable, completely stripped of her golden child arrogance. It was all a lie. "Chloe," she sobbed, rocking back and forth. "All of it. Todd wasn't making any money. His real estate business was failing. He was financing his Porsche on credit. He only proposed to me because Dad promised him exclusive commercial real estate contracts once he became vice president at Sentinel." I walked into the bathroom, grabbed a thick, clean towel, and walked back to the entryway. I tossed it over her wet shoulders. "So when Dad got fired and the wedding money evaporated, Todd realized there was no payload. He sent me a text message," Abigail cried, clutching the towel like a lifeline. She looked up at me, her eyes wild with betrayal. "A text message. Chloe. He said the financial dynamics of our relationship were no longer viable. Then he packed his bags, blocked my number, and left the apartment. He didn't even pay this month's rent. I'm getting evicted." I leaned against the wall across from her, crossing my arms. "What about the diamond ring?" Abigail let out a bitter, hysterical laugh, holding up her left hand. The gaudy, massive rock that she had shoved in my face at the family dinner was gone. Only a pale indentation remained on her finger. "It was cubic zirconia. He pawned the real one 3 months ago to pay off a gambling debt. The jeweler laughed at me when I tried to sell it this afternoon." The poetry of the situation was almost too perfect. Todd, the man who had mocked my government salary and called me a paper pusher, was nothing more than a parasitic fraud, feeding off the illusion of my father's corporate power. And Abigail, who had built her entire identity around a status and material wealth, had been completely duped by a cheap imitation. "Mom and Dad can't help me," Abigail continued, her voice dropping to a hoarse whisper. "Dad is drinking heavily. The bank is foreclosing on the house because they missed 3 mortgage payments. Mom is trying to sell her designer clothes online just to buy groceries. Chloe, I have absolutely nothing. I don't know what to do. She looked at me, her tear-streaked face silently begging for the exact same thing my mother had begged for, a savior. She was looking at the sister she had mocked, belittled, and dismissed as a freeloader, hoping I would magically rebuild the comfortable, wealthy reality she had just lost. I looked around my small, Spartan apartment. There were no chandeliers, there was no fine china. There was just a clean kitchen, a well-worn couch, and the quiet dignity of a life built on discipline and actual, tangible work. Get up. Abigail, I said, my voice commanding but devoid of malice. She blinked, confused by the lack of sympathy, but her deeply ingrained instinct to follow orders kicked in. She slowly stood up, pulling the towel tighter around her shoulders. I am not going to pay your rent, I told her, holding her gaze with absolute authority. I am not going to fund your lifestyle, and I am not going to fix the mess that you, Todd, and Dad created. You spent your entire life believing that your worth was tied to a zip code and a designer label. Now you get to find out who you actually are without them. Abigail's lower lip trembled, a fresh wave of tears threatening to spill. So you're just going to throw me out in the rain? No, I replied, walking into the kitchen. I pulled a mug from the cabinet and poured her a cup of hot black coffee. I walked back and handed it to her. You can sleep on my couch tonight. Tomorrow morning, you are going to wake up at 0600. You are going to take a shower, put on the cleanest clothes you have in that box, and you are going to go find a job that actually pays a reliable paycheck. You're going to learn how to survive in the real world. Abigail took the warm mug, her hands shaking. She looked down at her ruined designer shoes, then up at me, a flicker of genuine, begrudging respect finally penetrating her shattered ego. Welcome to the working class, sister, I said quietly. It's about time you pulled your own weight. The alarm on my nightstand blared precisely at 0530. I was already awake, lacing up my running shoes in the pre-dawn darkness. I walked into the living room, where the glow of the streetlights illuminated my sister curled beneath a gray wool blanket on the sofa. Abigail looked small, stripped of her designer armor and the unearned confidence that had defined her entire existence. Get up, I said, my voice sharp enough to cut through the quiet apartment, but quiet enough not to be a shout. It's 0530. The civilian world starts moving in 2 hours. Abigail groaned, pulling the blanket over her head. Chloe, please, I barely slept. My back is killing me. Can I just have one day to process my trauma? You can process your trauma while you fill out applications, I replied, walking over and aggressively yanking the blanket off the couch. The cold air hit her, and she gasped, sitting up with a glare of pure venom. You have exactly 30 minutes to shower and make yourself presentable. The local grocery chain is hiring assistant shift managers. The bank down the street needs tellers. You have a degree in communications. It's time to actually communicate your value to an employer who doesn't care about Dad's golf handicap. She opened her mouth to argue, her lower lip quivering, but the cold, unyielding expression on my face stopped her. The golden child was dead. The refugee was learning the rules of the safe house without another word. She dragged herself off the couch and trudged toward the bathroom. By the time I returned from my 5-mile run and showered, Abigail was sitting at my small kitchen table, staring blankly at a laptop screen filled with job board listings. I set a travel mug of coffee next to her, grabbed my keys, and headed out the door. The rehabilitation of my sister was a long-term project. I had a military to run. When I arrived at Fort Liberty, the atmosphere in the Joint Special Operations Command Logistics bullpen was highly irregular. Instead of the usual hum of tactical supply coordination, 3 men in dark, conservative suits were standing outside my glass-walled office, speaking quietly with Captain Sarah Jenkins. The red lanyards around their necks identified them as auditors from the Defense Contract Audit Agency. the DoD's Financial Watchdog Division. I approached the group, my tactical instincts immediately kicking in. Captain Jenkins, gentlemen, to what do I owe the pleasure of a DCAA visit at 0800? The lead auditor, a balding man with wire-rimmed glasses and a permanently exhausted expression, extended his hand. Major Davidson, I am Special Agent Miller, DCAA. We are conducting a retroactive financial sweep of Sentinel Defense Solutions legacy contracts, triggered by the approval of Project Vanguard. Standard procedure for a contract of that magnitude, I acknowledged, unlocking my office door and gesturing for them to enter. What do you need from my division? All Vanguard files were fully vetted before I signed the authorization. We aren't here about Vanguard, Major, Miller said, taking a seat across from my desk. He opened a thick, red-tabbed classified folder. We are here about the Regional Domestic Supply Division, the body armor and tactical gear supply lines managed by Sentinel over the last 5 years. Our automated algorithms flagged several highly anomalous billing patterns. Sarah Jenkins stepped forward, her expression grim. Major, the DCAA algorithms found a network of shell companies. For the past 4 years, Sentinel's regional division has been subcontracting Kevlar fabric acquisition to third-party vendors that don't actually exist. The invoices were heavily inflated, paid by the DoD, and then the excess funds were routed into offshore, untraceable accounts. I felt the temperature in the room drop. The pieces of a very ugly, very familiar puzzle were suddenly snapping together with terrifying clarity. Who was the Sentinel executive possessing signatory authority for the Regional Domestic Supply Division during that time frame? Agent Miller looked me dead in the eye, fully aware of the grenade he was about to drop. The authorizing signatures belonged to the recently terminated Vice President of Regional Supply, Richard Davidson. Your father? The silence in my office was absolute. Sarah looked at the floor, clearly uncomfortable with the revelation, but I didn't feel shock. I didn't feel embarrassment. I felt the cold, hard click of mathematical logic finally making sense. The mortgage, I whispered to myself, the reality washing over me. The country club, the Mercedes, Abigail's wedding deposit. For years, I had quietly wondered how a middle management regional director at a defense contractor could afford the obscenely lavish lifestyle my parents flaunted. I had assumed it was a mountain of reckless credit card debt, a house of cards waiting to collapse. But the truth was far more sinister. My father wasn't just a corporate climber, he was a white-collar criminal. He had been actively embezzling federal defense funds to pay for his country club dues. He had stolen from the very government that funded the soldiers I commanded. Major Davidson, Agent Miller said carefully, his tone entirely professional. Given the familial relationship, DoD ethical guidelines mandate that we formally notify you of this investigation and require your immediate recusal from any logistical oversight involving Sentinel's legacy files. Agent Miller, you have my full, unconditional cooperation, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. I opened my desk drawer, pulled out a formal recusal form, and signed my name with sharp, aggressive strokes. I slid the paper across the desk. I want it on the official record that I am recusing myself from this audit. You have unlimited access to my division servers. Captain Jenkins will assist you in pulling every single invoice Richard Davidson ever submitted to this command. Miller looked surprised by my lack of hesitation. Major, we are talking about federal wire fraud and defrauding the United States government. If these charges stick, the mandatory minimum is 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Then I highly suggest you dig deep, Agent Miller, I replied, my eyes hardening into flint. Because if that man compromised the supply lines of my soldiers to pay for his luxury car, 20 years is a mercy. It took the Defense Contract Audit Agency and the FBI exactly 48 hours to compile a bulletproof indictment against Richard Davidson. The speed of the investigation was a testament to my father's arrogance. He hadn't even bothered to properly hide his tracks. He had treated the federal defense budget like a personal slush fund, leaving a digital paper trail so wide a first-year accounting student could have followed it. It was Saturday morning. Abigail had just finished her third day of training as a shift supervisor at a local coffee shop. She walked into my apartment smelling of roasted espresso beans and stale milk, wearing a green apron that she clearly despised but was too exhausted to complain about. "I need to go to the house," Abigail announced, dropping her keys on the counter. She looked at me, her eyes completely devoid of their former entitlement. "The bank sent Mom a formal notice of foreclosure yesterday. She has 30 days to vacate. I need to get my passport, my birth certificate, and the rest of my winter clothes before the bank locks the doors." I looked up from the operational report I was reading. Letting her go to that house alone while my father was actively spiraling was a tactical error. "I'll drive you. Get in the car." The drive to the upscale manicured suburb was silent. Abigail stared out the window, watching the familiar landscape of her privileged youth roll by, the sprawling lawns, the pristine sidewalks, the illusion of safety and superiority. It all looked exactly the same, but it felt entirely alien to both of us now. As we turned onto my parents' street, I immediately noticed the disruption in the neighborhood's perfect aesthetic. 3 black, unmarked SUVs with heavily tinted windows were parked haphazardly on the pristine cobblestone driveway. 2 local police cruisers were idling at the curb, their lights flashing silently, casting a harsh blue and red glow across the manicured rose bushes. "Chloe, what is happening?" Abigail gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as I pulled the sedan to a stop across the street. The heavy oak front door of the Davidson residence was wide open. Several men and women wearing tactical vests emblazoned with FBI in bold yellow letters were moving methodically through the house, carrying out cardboard boxes full of documents and hard drives. Suddenly, my mother stumbled out onto the front porch. Brenda was wearing a silk bathrobe, her hair a wild, uncombed mess, her face completely pale. She was screaming hysterically, clutching the porch railing as if the earth had opened up beneath her. A moment later, my father emerged. Richard Davidson was not walking with his chest puffed out. He was not barking orders or talking about his country club handicap. He was being physically escorted down his own front steps by 2 stern-faced federal agents. His hands were securely handcuffed behind his back. The arrogant patriarch who had demanded excellence and conformity was weeping openly, his face a mask of absolute, unadulterated terror. Across the street, Mrs. Harrison, the neighborhood gossip my mother had feared so deeply, was standing on her pristine lawn, holding a watering can and staring with wide, horrified eyes. The entire country club circuit would know by noon. The humiliation was absolute, total, and inescapable. "Dad," Abigail whispered, her voice cracking. She reached for the door handle of my car, instinctively wanting to run to him. I hit the central locking button, the sharp click freezing her in place. "Do not get out of this car. Abigail, that is an active federal crime scene." As the agents led my father toward the center SUV, his wild, panicking eyes scanned the street. He saw my rented sedan. He saw me sitting in the driver's seat, watching the destruction of his empire with cold, analytical detachment. "Chloe!" my father shrieked, fighting against the grip of the federal agents. His voice echoed down the quiet suburban street, raw and pathetic. "Chloe, tell them it's a mistake. Tell them who you are. Call General Henderson. You have to fix this. I am your father. I am your father." The FBI agents shoved him forcefully into the back of the SUV, entirely unimpressed by his screaming. They slammed the heavy door shut, instantly cutting off his pathetic wails. My mother collapsed onto the front lawn, burying her face in the wet grass, entirely broken by the sheer, public devastation of her perfectly curated life. The illusion was dead. The money was gone. The respect she had craved had evaporated into thin air. Abigail sat in the passenger seat beside me, trembling violently. Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't ask me to unlock the door. She didn't ask me to intervene. She just watched as the black SUVs pulled away from the curb, carrying the architect of our family's misery off to federal prison. He stole from the military, I told Abigail quietly, keeping my eyes fixed on the empty driveway. He embezzled millions of dollars from the defense budget to pay for that house, your wedding, and his ego. That is who you were worshiping all these years. Abigail slowly turned her head to look at me. The final vestiges of the golden child were completely gone, replaced by the crushing, terrifying weight of reality. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice small and lost. "You go to your shift at the coffee shop tomorrow," I replied, shifting the car into drive and pulling away from the house of lies for the last time. "You earn an honest paycheck, and you never, ever let anyone tell you that honest work makes you a freeloader. The legal machinery of the federal government moves with a slow, grinding inevitability, and my father was directly in its path. 3 days after the FBI raided the Davidson household, I received a formal summons to the United States Attorney's Office in downtown Raleigh. I signed out a motor pool vehicle from Fort Liberty, dressed in my standard Class B uniform, and drove to the federal building. The sky was a bruised, overcast gray, perfectly reflecting the grim reality of the situation. I was escorted into a sterile, windowless conference room where Assistant United States Attorney Robert Davis was waiting for me. "I will get straight to the point. Your father has retained a high-priced defense attorney, presumably funded by whatever liquid assets the FBI hasn't frozen yet. They had their first proffer session this morning, attempting to negotiate a plea deal. I assume he offered up everyone he could think of to save his own skin," I replied, sitting perfectly straight. I knew my father's psychology intimately. Loyalty was a foreign concept to him. Self-preservation was his only religion. "He tried," Davis confirmed, pulling a legal pad toward him. "Richard is attempting to argue that he was simply a pawn in a larger, systemic corporate culture at Sentinel Defense Solutions. But more disturbingly, Major, he attempted to leverage you." I didn't flinch. My expression remained entirely impassive, but beneath my collar, my pulse quickened with a sudden, icy fury. "Explain." Davis adjusted his glasses, looking at me with a mixture of professional scrutiny and genuine disgust for his target. "Your father claimed that his shell companies were actually classified black budget accounts. He told my investigators that you, acting in your capacity as a JSOC logistics commander, verbally authorized the inflation of Kevlar supply invoices to secretly fund off-the-books intelligence operations. He is essentially claiming that you masterminded the embezzlement and he was just following orders to protect national security." The sheer, unadulterated audacity of the lie was breathtaking. My father, cornered like a rat in a trap, was actively trying to frame his own daughter for federal treason to shave a few years off his impending prison sentence. He was willing to strip me of my rank, my clearance, and my freedom just to save himself. "Mr. Davis," I said, my voice dropping into a register of absolute, terrifying calm. In 2023, the fiscal year when those shell companies were officially incorporated, I was deployed to a forward operating base in the Kunar province of Afghanistan. I had zero oversight of Sentinel Defense Solutions. My internet access was restricted to heavily encrypted military satellites, and all of my communications were logged by the Department of Defense. Furthermore, I did not assume command of domestic supply logistics until 14 months ago. "I know." "Major," Davis replied, a faint, shark-like smile touching the corners of his mouth. "We pulled your service jacket before the meeting. We know it's a complete fabrication. Your alibi is ironclad and documented by the Pentagon. But I needed you to hear exactly what kind of man we are prosecuting. Add obstruction of justice and lying to federal agents to his indictment," I stated coldly. "Bury him." "We intend to..." Davis nodded, closing his legal pad. The defense strategy just completely imploded. He handed us the shovel, and we are going to let him dig all the way to the bottom. I left the federal building feeling a profound sense of finality. The last lingering shred of familial obligation I might have subconsciously harbored for my father was entirely incinerated. When I returned to my apartment that evening, I found Abigail sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of tea. She had just finished a 9-hour shift at the coffee shop, and her hands were raw from washing industrial espresso equipment. She looked up as I walked in, her expression exhausted but remarkably grounded. "Mom called me," Abigail said quietly. "The bank officially locked the doors to the house today. She is staying at the Starlight Motel on Interstate 40. She asked if she could move in with us." I set my keys on the counter. The Starlight Motel was a rundown, miserable establishment completely devoid of the luxury my mother believed was her birthright. "What did you tell her?" "I told her it wasn't my apartment," Abigail said, staring down at her tea. "And I told her that even if it was, the answer would be no." I looked at my younger sister, feeling a rare surge of genuine pride. Abigail was surviving the crucible. "I am going to drive out there tonight and handle it. Stay here. Rest." I drove out to the highway, pulling my sedan into the flickering neon parking lot of the motel. I found room 114 and knocked sharply. The door opened to reveal Brenda Davidson. She looked absolutely ruined. Her blonde hair was flat and greasy, and she was wearing a wrinkled tracksuit. The room behind her smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap disinfectant. "Chloe," she breathed, her eyes lighting up with a desperate, pathetic hope. "Oh, thank God. Did you bring the car? Can I get my bags?" "I'm not here to pack your bags, Mom," I said, stepping into the doorway but refusing to enter the room. Brenda's face fell, the brief flicker of hope instantly transforming into a panicked betrayal. "Chloe, please, I have $84 to my name. My credit cards are declined. The country club canceled my membership. Mrs. Harrison won't even answer my phone calls. Everyone abandoned me. You have to let me stay with you and Abigail. Abigail is a refugee from your toxic parenting." "Mom," I told her, my voice completely stripped of empathy. "She is currently unlearning the absolute garbage you instilled in her head for 25 years. She was working on her feet for minimum wage, learning the value of $1, and figuring out who she is without a designer label attached to her spine. I will not let you bring your disease into my home and infect her again." I reached into the pocket of my tactical fleece and pulled out a plain white envelope, handing it to her. "What is this?" Brenda asked, her hands shaking as she took it. "It's a one-way Greyhound bus ticket to Aunt Susan's house in Cleveland, Ohio," I said. Susan was Brenda's older sister, a woman my mother had mocked for years because she lived in a modest duplex and worked as a public school teacher. "Susan agreed to let you sleep in her guest room. The bus leaves at 0800 tomorrow morning. I strongly suggest you be on it." Brenda looked at the bus ticket as if it were a venomous snake. "A bus? To Cleveland? Chloe, I can't live like that." "You don't have a choice," I replied, stepping back out into the humid night air. "The illusion is over. Mom, have a safe trip." 7 months later, the unseasonably warm North Carolina spring had settled over the city of Raleigh. The federal courthouse stood as a towering monument of limestone and glass, its heavy pillars casting long, imposing shadows over the concrete steps. Today was the final chapter of the Davidson family collapse. Today was the day Richard Davidson faced the consequences of his arrogance. I stood in the corridor outside courtroom 4B, adjusting the collar of my Army service uniform. I was dressed in full, immaculate military dress. The silver oak leaves of my rank glinted sharply on my shoulders, and 3 rows of meticulously arranged ribbons sat perfectly level over my left breast pocket. I was not there as Chloe, the disappointing daughter. I was attending in my official capacity as Major Davidson, representing the logistical command that Richard had so brazenly defrauded. Abigail stood next to me. The transformation she had undergone over the past 7 months was nothing short of miraculous. She was wearing a simple, conservative navy dress that she had purchased with her own wages from the coffee shop. She had recently been promoted to store manager, an accomplishment she was actually proud of. Her cubic zirconia ring was long gone, replaced by a quiet, resilient dignity. "Are you ready?" I asked her, my voice low. "I just want it to be over," Abigail whispered back, staring at the heavy wooden double doors of the courtroom. We walked inside and took our seats in the second row of the gallery. The courtroom was vast, intimidating, and nearly empty. There were no country club friends to support him. Todd, the parasitic ex-fiancé, was completely absent. Brenda was 500 miles away in Ohio, refusing to answer the phone. The only people in the gallery were a few court reporters and the two daughters he had spent a lifetime degrading. A side door opened, and a federal marshal led my father into the room. The sight of him was jarring. Richard Davidson, the man who had obsessively curated his image with bespoke Italian suits and imported silk ties, was wearing an ill-fitting, standard-issue tan prison jumpsuit. He was handcuffed, his wrists shackled to a chain around his waist. He had lost at least 30 pounds. His skin was an unhealthy, pallid gray, and his remaining hair was entirely white. He looked small, broken, and entirely pathetic. As he shuffled to the defense table, he slowly turned his head and looked at the gallery. His hollow eyes found Abigail first, and a flicker of deep shame washed over his face. Then, his gaze shifted to me. He took in the crisp edges of my uniform, the medals on my chest, and the absolute, unyielding coldness in my eyes. He swallowed hard and quickly looked away, completely unable to hold my stare. The bailiff announced the arrival of Honorable Judge Gregory Wallace, a stern, no-nonsense jurist with zero tolerance for white-collar theft. The court was called to order. Because Richard had ultimately pled guilty to 3 counts of federal wire fraud and 1 count of perjury, a desperate plea deal forced by the collapse of his lie about my involvement. There was no jury. This was strictly a sentencing hearing. "Before I hand down this sentence," Judge Wallace stated, his voice echoing off the mahogany-paneled walls, "the court recognizes Major Chloe Davidson, representing the United States Armed Forces, for a victim impact statement." I stood up, stepping out of the pew and walking deliberately to the wooden podium in the center of the courtroom. The room was dead silent. I placed my hands on the edges of the podium, projecting my voice clearly across the room, ensuring that every single word hit my father like a physical blow. "Your Honor," I began, looking directly at Judge Wallace. "For 5 years, the defendant utilized his position as a defense contractor to systematically siphon millions of dollars away from the Department of Defense. But this was not a victimless corporate crime. The money the defendant stole was specifically allocated for the procurement of Level 4 Kevlar body armor for American soldiers operating in hostile combat zones." I turned my head slightly, locking eyes with the broken man sitting at the defense table. He flinched, shrinking down into his chair. "The defendant's actions forced supply chain delays, compromised the structural integrity of our defensive logistics, and directly endangered the lives of the men and women under my command," I continued, my voice ringing with righteous, controlled fury. "He did not steal out of desperation. He did not steal to feed a starving family. He stole to fund a lifestyle of arrogant, unchecked vanity. He looked at the uniform of the United States military and saw nothing but a bank account to be exploited. He possesses no honor, no ethical compass, and no respect for the country that facilitated his privilege." I turned back to the judge. "The military respectfully requests the maximum allowable sentence." "Thank you, Your Honor." I stepped away from the podium and walked back to my seat next to Abigail. The absolute silence in the courtroom was suffocating. My father was crying silently, his head bowed so low it nearly touched the defense table. Judge Wallace adjusted his glasses, looking down at the man before him with profound disgust. "Richard Davidson, your crimes demonstrate a breathtaking level of greed and a complete disregard for the safety of our armed forces. attempting to implicate your own daughter, an active-duty military officer, in your scheme only further highlights your catastrophic lack of character." The judge picked up his wooden gavel. "It is the judgment of this court that you be committed to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons to be imprisoned for a term of 180 months. Judge Wallace declared, 15 years. This sentence is to be served in a medium security facility, without the possibility of early parole. Court is adjourned." The gavel slammed down with a sharp, echoing crack. The federal marshals immediately stepped forward, grabbing my father by the arms and hauling him to his feet. As they dragged him toward the side door, he looked back at the gallery one last time. There was no defiance left. There was no arrogance. There was only the terrifying realization that he was entirely alone, exactly where he deserved to be. Abigail and I walked out of the courtroom together, pushing through the heavy wooden doors and stepping out onto the sunlit concrete steps of the courthouse. The warm air felt incredibly clean. I looked at my sister, the coffee shop manager, and smiled. The freeloader and the golden child had finally broken free from the patriarch's toxic empire. Our real lives could finally begin. By October, the blistering North Carolina summer had finally surrendered to the crisp, biting winds of autumn. Life in Raleigh had settled into a predictable, highly functional rhythm. I was deeply entrenched in the logistical rollout of Project Vanguard at Fort Liberty, overseeing the deployment of the encrypted drone networks that Sentinel Defense Solutions had successfully engineered. My sister, Abigail, had officially hit her 6-month mark as the store manager at Capitol Street Roasters, a high-volume, independent coffee shop in the heart of the city's financial district. I made it a habit to stop by her shop every Friday morning at 06:30 before making the drive to the base. Watching Abigail command her floor was genuinely impressive. The girl who used to cry if a manicurist chipped her polish was now effortlessly directing 3 baristas, managing inventory shortages, and ejecting unruly customers with a polite, ironclad authority. She wore her denim work apron like body armor. The transformation was complete, and the golden child was officially dead. It was during one of these routine Friday visits that the ghosts of our toxic past decided to make an uninvited appearance. I was sitting at a small corner table near the window, sipping a black coffee and reviewing a digital topographical map on my tablet. The morning rush was in full swing. The bell above the glass door chimed, admitting a blast of cold air and a figure that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up on instinct. It was Todd. My sister's former fiancé looked absolutely abysmal. The slick, aggressively confident real estate broker who used to exclusively wear tailored Italian suits and heavily gelled hair was gone. He was wearing a rumpled, ill-fitting gray blazer over a stained dress shirt. He had a patchy, unkempt beard and the nervous, darting energy of a man who was running out of places to hide. I closed my tablet, my tactical instincts shifting instantly into high gear. I didn't stand up. I wanted to see how Abigail handled an ambush. Todd bypassed the long line of commuters and marched directly up to the mobile order pickup counter, where Abigail was rapidly calling out drinks. "Abigail," Todd said, his voice loud enough to turn the heads of several customers. "We need to talk. Right now." Abigail paused, holding a steaming paper cup in her hand. She looked up, her expression freezing for a fraction of a second before hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. She didn't flinch. She didn't reach for her cubic zirconia ring that was no longer there. "I'm in the middle of a rush." "Todd," Abigail said, her voice perfectly level, carrying across the noisy cafe. "Get to the back of the line if you want to order. Otherwise, get out of my store." "I am not playing games. Abby?" Todd hissed, leaning over the counter and invading her personal space. He smelled of stale beer and cheap cologne. "I lost my job at the brokerage. My landlord is evicting me on Monday. Your father promised me a $50,000 commission on a commercial lease near the Sentinel headquarters, and he went to federal prison before paying up. I need that money. I know you have it." Abigail actually laughed. It was a sharp, biting sound that completely stripped Todd of his remaining dignity. You think I have $50,000? I work 50 hours a week making lattes. Todd, my father is in a federal penitentiary because he was broke and embezzling. There is no money. There never was. Don't lie to me, Todd snapped, his voice rising in panic. He slammed his hand against the counter, rattling the ceramic tip jar. I know your sister is some high-ranking military VIP. I know she's sitting on a government pension. You tell Chloe to write me a check, or I am going straight to the local news. I will tell them that Major Chloe Davidson knew all about her father's fraud and covered it up until it was convenient. I will ruin her career. Abby, I will burn this whole family to the ground. I watched from the corner, genuinely curious to see my sister's next move. 10 months ago, Abigail would have collapsed into a puddle of tears at the threat of public humiliation. Abigail slowly set the paper cup down. She leaned forward, resting her forearms on the counter, bringing her face inches from Todd's sweating, desperate face. "Burn it down?" Abigail whispered, her voice laced with a lethal calm that I recognized intimately. It was the exact tone I used when disciplining an insubordinate soldier. "Todd, our father is in a cage. Our mother is living in a basement in Ohio. Our house was seized by the FBI. There is nothing left for you to burn. And if you think a local news station is going to believe a fired, bankrupt real estate agent over a decorated JSOC commander who literally triggered the federal audit that caught the criminal, you are even stupider than I thought." Todd stared at her, his jaw slack, completely paralyzed by her utter lack of fear. "Now," Abigail commanded, pointing a single, calloused finger toward the exit. "You are trespassing in my place of business. You have exactly 10 seconds to walk out that door, or I am calling the Raleigh Police Department and having you arrested for public harassment. 1, 2. Todd didn't wait for Abigail to reach 3. The sheer, terrifying conviction in her eyes shattered whatever pathetic illusion of control he had left. He backed away from the counter, almost tripping over a businessman's briefcase, and practically sprinted out the glass door into the cold October wind. I stood up from my corner table, picked up my coffee mug, and walked over to the counter. The other baristas were staring at Abigail with wide-eyed reverence. The morning commuters, sensing the drama had concluded, slowly turned back to their phones. "Your form was excellent," I noted calmly, taking a sip of my dark roast, though you could have explicitly mentioned that federal extortion carries a mandatory minimum sentence. It usually expedites the retreat. Abigail let out a long, shaky breath, wiping her hands on her denim apron. A small, triumphant smile broke across her face. "I'll keep that in mind for next time. Did you know he was coming?" "I had no idea," I replied honestly. "But parasites usually return to the host when they run out of food. You handled it perfectly. You didn't need me to fight that battle." "No," she agreed, her chin lifting with quiet pride. "I didn't. I thought the Todd situation was officially neutralized, but I severely underestimated the sheer, suicidal desperation of a man who was facing homelessness. At 1300 hours that afternoon, I was back at my desk at Fort Liberty, reviewing a supply manifest for a deployment to Eastern Europe. My secure, encrypted desk phone rang. I picked up the receiver, expecting the logistics liaison at the Pentagon. "Major Davidson." The deep, unmistakable gravelly baritone of Arthur Kensington echoed through the earpiece. "Arthur," I replied, leaning back in my ergonomic chair. "Project Vanguard is operating at 98% efficiency on the current drone trial. To what do I owe the call?" "The drones are performing beautifully, Major, but I'm not calling about military hardware," Arthur said, an undercurrent of dark amusement lacing his words. "I am currently sitting in the executive boardroom of Sentinel's Raleigh headquarters, and I have a very sweaty, very frantic young man named Todd sitting across from me, demanding $250,000 in hush money." I closed my eyes, letting out a heavy sigh of profound irritation. Todd had actually bypassed the family and gone straight to the billionaire. Let me guess. He claims he has a hard drive full of my father's classified regional supply files, and he's threatening to expose Sentinel's internal oversight failures to the media if you don't pay him off. Spot on. Major. Arthur chuckled, the sound devoid of any actual humor. He's currently trying to quote non-disclosure agreements he clearly researched on Wikipedia this morning. I've already had my corporate security team run a background check. He has nothing. He is a ghost, trying to cast a shadow. Do you want me to send federal marshals to your lobby, Arthur? Extorting a major defense contractor is a federal crime, I offered, already opening my email to draft the warrant request. No need. Chloe, Arthur replied easily. My legal team is already drafting a cease and desist so draconian it will legally prohibit him from ever speaking the word Sentinel for the rest of his life. I merely wanted to keep you informed of the debris your father left behind. However, I actually called because of your sister. I paused, my hand hovering over my keyboard. Abigail? Yes? During the background check on this idiot sitting in my lobby, my security team naturally pulled updated files on the immediate Davidson family. Standard procedure to ensure no residual security risks, Arthur explained. I was informed that Abigail lost her fiancé, her home, and her lifestyle overnight. But instead of running to the press or begging for a handout, she took a job managing a local coffee shop and has been working 60-hour weeks for the past 7 months. She has, I confirmed, feeling a protective instinct flare up. She has completely severed ties with my father's toxic mentality. She's earning her own way. That takes a tremendous amount of character. Major, Arthur said, his voice shifting into absolute sincerity. When your father sat in my dining room, he proved he was weak. He crumbled under the weight of his own arrogance. But your sister took a catastrophic loss and rebuilt her foundation on concrete instead of sand. I respect that. Sentinel respects that. Arthur paused for a brief moment, letting the weight of his words settle. I am expanding my corporate compliance and oversight division next month. Arthur continued. I need hungry, resilient junior project managers who understand the absolute devastation that comes from corporate corruption. I want people who aren't afraid of hard work and won't be intimidated by executives in expensive suits. Have Abigail send her resume to my personal executive assistant. If she passes the standard interviews, she has a legitimate entry-level job waiting for her here. I stared at the wall of my office, genuinely stunned. This was not nepotism. This was not Arthur doing me a favor. Arthur Kensington was a ruthless businessman. He didn't hand out charity. He was offering Abigail a position because she had proven she possessed the exact grit my father lacked. I will relay the message, Arthur, I said quietly. Thank you. That evening, I drove back to Abigail's small, rented apartment. When I handed her the sticky note with Arthur Kensington's private assistant's email address and explained the offer, she didn't scream or jump up and down. She just stared at the piece of paper, her eyes welling with tears that she quickly wiped away. She wasn't being handed a free ride. She was being handed a shovel and a chance to dig her own path, and for the first time in her entire life, my sister was truly ready to work. Abigail's integration into Sentinel Defense Solutions was anything but a smooth, red carpet rollout. Arthur Kensington was a man of his word. He provided the opportunity, but he absolutely did not provide a safety net. My sister was hired as a junior compliance analyst, an entry-level grind that required long hours, meticulous attention to detail, and a thick skin. She was placed under the direct supervision of Diane Carter, a notoriously ruthless director of oversight who had survived 3 decades in the male-dominated defense industry by suffering exactly 0 fools. On Abigail's first day, she walked into the sprawling, glass and steel Sentinel headquarters in downtown Raleigh. It was the exact same building where our father had reigned as a corrupt vice president. It was the same lobby where Todd had spectacularly imploded just weeks prior. The name Davidson carried a heavy, toxic stigma within those walls. When Abigail received her corporate badge, the whispers in the break room were immediate and unforgiving. People assumed she was a spy. a liability, or the beneficiary of a twisted nepotism pity hire. But my sister didn't cower. She didn't retreat to the bathroom to cry, and she didn't try to leverage our father's ghost. Instead, she put her head down and worked with the mechanical, relentless efficiency she had learned behind the espresso machine. 4 months into her tenure, Abigail and I were sitting in my small apartment, eating takeout sushi on the coffee table. The dynamic between us had fundamentally shifted. We were no longer the disappointing soldier and the golden child. We were two professional women navigating high-stakes environments. Diane gave me the quarterly vendor audit for the Pacific Fleet tactical gear supply, Abigail said, dipping a spicy tuna roll into soy sauce. She looked exhausted, her hair pulled back into a messy clip, but her eyes were bright and fully engaged. It's a massive file, over 3,000 individual invoices. Everyone in the department assumed I would pawn it off on the interns, but I've been going through it line by line for 3 weeks. And? I asked, recognizing the specific gleam of victory in her eye. And I found a discrepancy. Abigail smiled, a genuine, hard-earned expression of pride. It wasn't a shell company like Dad's. It was a legitimate subcontractor supplying synthetic webbing for the plate carriers. But they were utilizing a rolling currency conversion trick on their international shipping tariffs, skimming roughly 4 cents off the top of every yard of webbing. Over 3 years, it amounted to a $200,000 overcharge to the Department of Defense. I set my chopsticks down, genuinely impressed. Finding a micro-skimming operation buried in international tariff conversions required a brutal level of forensic accounting. Did you take it to Diane? I bypassed the standard reporting chain and walked the file straight into her office this morning. Abigail nodded. I outlined the exact mechanism of the fraud, highlighted the specific ledger entries, and drafted a termination notice for the vendor. Diane didn't say a word for 5 minutes. She just read the file. Then she looked up at me, signed the termination notice, and told me I was leading the compliance presentation at the executive board meeting on Monday. Arthur will be at that meeting, I noted, feeling a surge of profound pride. I know, Abigail said softly, looking down at her hands. When I walked out of Diane's office, I realized something. Chloe. For the first time in my life, nobody was looking at me because of the clothes I was wearing, or the car I drove, or the man I was standing next to. They were looking at me because I actually did the work. It's a really good feeling. As Abigail thrived, the parasitic remnants of our past were rapidly meeting their inevitable conclusions. The following morning, I was sitting at my desk at Fort Liberty when Captain Sarah Jenkins walked into my office and placed a copy of the Raleigh News and Observer on my keyboard. I thought you might find the local crime blotter interesting this morning. Major, Sarah said, tapping a small article near the bottom of the page before stepping out of the office. I leaned forward and read the headline, Local Real Estate Agent Indicted in Widespread Rental Fraud Scheme. I scanned the brief article. Todd had finally hit the absolute bottom of his downward spiral. Desperate for cash after being evicted, he had begun listing vacant, bank-owned properties on the internet, posing as the property manager. He had collected thousands of dollars in fake security deposits from unsuspecting college students and working-class families before the Raleigh Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit kicked down the door of his cheap motel room. He was currently sitting in the county jail, entirely unable to post his $50,000 bail. I folded the newspaper and tossed it into the recycling bin. Todd had spent his life belittling people who worked honest, government jobs, completely convinced that his slick charm and unearned entitlement elevated him above the working class. Now, he was going to spend the next 5 to 10 years wearing a state-issued uniform, living entirely at the mercy of the taxpayers he had so deeply despised. The universe, it seemed, possessed an incredibly sharp sense of irony. The letter arrived in a standard, unadorned white envelope, stamped with the unmistakable red seal of the Federal Correctional Institution, Butner Low. It was addressed to both Abigail and me, mailed to my apartment. I hadn't spoken to my father since the day Judge Wallace sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison. I opened the letter standing in my kitchen. It was written in blue ink, his handwriting shaky and diminished, entirely lacking the bold, aggressive strokes that used to define his signature. It was a formal visitor request. He was asking us to come to the prison on Sunday afternoon. "I'm going," Abigail said. She was standing by the refrigerator, holding her Sentinel corporate badge. "I don't want a relationship with him. I don't want to forgive him. But I want him to look at me and see exactly what I've built without his money. Then we go together." I agreed, tossing the letter into the trash. The drive to the federal penitentiary in Butner, North Carolina, was solemn. The facility was a sprawling complex of concrete, razor wire, and heavily fortified guard towers, surrounded by dense pine forests. We passed through 3 separate security checkpoints, surrendered our cell phones, and walked through a metal detector before being escorted into the sterile, overwhelmingly depressing visitors' room. The room smelled faintly of industrial floor wax and stale sweat. Fluorescent lights buzzed loudly overhead. We took our seats at a small, bolted-down metal table. 10 minutes later, a heavy steel door buzzed open, and Richard Davidson walked in. If the sentencing hearing had broken him, 18 months of federal incarceration had entirely erased him. He looked ancient. His skin hung loosely on his frame. His posture was permanently stooped, and his eyes were dull and hollow. He shuffled toward our table, sitting down heavily in the plastic chair across from us. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The silence was deafening, a massive chasm filled with the wreckage of our family. "You came?" Richard finally whispered, his voice raspy and weak. He looked at me, then at Abigail, his eyes lingering on the crisp, professional tailoring of her gray blazer. You look strong. Why did you ask us to come here, Annie?" "Dad?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely neutral. I was not there to offer comfort, nor was I there to inflict further pain. I was simply a witness to his reality. Richard swallowed hard, his trembling hands clasped together on the metal table. "I have a lot of time to think in here. I'm 23 hours a day in a cell. I think about that dinner. I think about the things I said. I needed to explain." He looked at Abigail, a desperate, pathetic light flickering in his eyes. "Abby, everything I did, the money, the corners I cut, I did it for the family. I did it to give you the life you deserved. The wedding, the country club. I was trying to be a good provider. Even now, sitting in a prison jumpsuit, he was still trying to peddle the illusion. He was still trying to frame his profound selfishness as a grand, paternal sacrifice. Abigail didn't flinch. She leaned forward, resting her arms on the table. The golden child, who used to hang on his every word, looked at him with nothing but clinical pity. "You didn't do it for me, Dad," Abigail said, her voice steady and unyielding. "You did it for yourself. You bought that lifestyle because you needed the Harrison family to think you were important. You bought that lifestyle because your ego required it. And when it all fell apart, you let Todd leave me. You let Mom get evicted, and you tried to frame Chloe for federal treason. A provider protects his family. You used us as human shields." Richard recoiled as if she had slapped him. Tears began to spill over his lower eyelids, tracking down his deeply lined cheeks. "Abby, please, I have nothing left. Mom won't accept my calls from Ohio. My lawyer dropped me. You are all I have. Tell me you're okay. Tell me Todd is taking care of you." "Todd is in the Wake County Jail for wire fraud," Abigail stated coldly, watching the shock ripple across our father's face. "And I don't need anyone to take care of me. I am a junior compliance analyst at Sentinel Defense Solutions. Arthur Kensington hired me personally. I spend my days auditing supply vendors to ensure they aren't embezzling federal funds like you did." Richard's jaw dropped. The ultimate poetic justice crashed down upon him in real time. The billionaire CEO who had fired him and facilitated his arrest had taken his youngest daughter, the one he had molded to be a superficial trophy, and turned her into the exact corporate watchdog that would have caught him. Arthur. Arthur hired you? Richard choked out, completely unable to process the magnitude of his absolute replacement. Yes, I interjected, deciding it was time to end the engagement. I stood up, adjusting the cuffs of my civilian jacket. He hired Abigail because she has integrity, a trait that is entirely foreign to you. We didn't come here to reconcile. Dad. We came here to close the door. Do not send us another visitor request. We will not return. Abigail stood up beside me, buttoning her blazer. She looked down at the weeping, broken man who used to terrify us with a single scowl. Goodbye, Richard. Enjoy the rest of your sentence. We turned our backs and walked toward the heavy steel exit doors. We didn't look over our shoulders. We walked out of the penitentiary, stepping out into the bright, warm North Carolina sun. We walked to my car, leaving the freeloader behind bars, completely secure in the knowledge that we had finally earned our peace. When the dust finally settled, the true definition of a freeloader was laid bare for the entire world to see. My father's obsession with status destroyed his freedom, while the quiet discipline he mocked forged an unbreakable bond between me and the sister I never thought I'd respect. True power doesn't come from a tailored suit or an embezzled bank account. It comes from integrity, resilience, and knowing your actual worth. If you loved hearing how this toxic empire crumbled and how Abigail and I rebuilt our lives from the ashes, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder about karma, and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life stories.